while Massachusetts Bay was growing in 50, 60 years, and Jamestown began to boom, what was going on in North Carolina? So we're going to be looking at how our colony finally got established. Remember, it was initially the first place where they wanted to create a settlement, and it failed. So how did we become a colony? First of all, our vocabulary here, and by the end of this you will understand what those are. How does Carolina begin to grow? The good land around Jamestown was being taken up. After about 70 years, this good growing land, and people had to move farther west, which got them closer to the mountains. The farmland was not as good. So people began to move south and west. And they began to move south, what we would call now crossing the Virginia-North Carolina line. And they began to settle around Albemarle Sound. And so the king is seeing these people move, and people move farther south, and he says, let's just create a different colony. Let's just, begin to divide this up. It'll be much more manageable. So he creates a new colony called Carolina, and he puts 8 lords that he knows in charge of it. And that they were called the Lord Proprietors. And the proprietor means the one kind of in charge of the land, the one in charge. And we were created in 1663. So that's when the king set up the legal documents and told these 8 gentlemen, these 8 lords, you have now control over this colony. So remember, the lords are in England, and they're looking at this, well, we have people living there, and what do most government people do when people live there? They make them pay taxes. So that is what the residents of Carolina Colony had to do. If they owned land, they had to pay a tax to the Lord Proprietors. And this was called a quit rent. And so you have people in North Carolina paying this tax on their property to these lords. Settlers in North Carolina were generally less wealthy than in Virginia. And a lot of this has to do with our soil and the geography of our state as people were moving south. It wasn't the great farmland that they had in Virginia. Virginia was more established. People were becoming very rich due to tobacco, and that wasn't happening. Tobacco was being grown, but we didn't have waterways, good river system to transport the tobacco, and we had a lot of strikes against us. So Virginia was growing. The settlers around Albemarle Sound were one district. The Lord Proprietors made that one district. The settlers around Pamlico Sound were in another district. So now we have, in North Carolina, these 2 districts forming, and like anything else, one district has interests and things that they would like, as opposed to another district who has things that they would want for theirs. But the very first town that was ever established in North Carolina is Bath, and that was named for a town in England. Other ways that Carolina grows. So we have them moving south. The king establishes a colony, but gives it to the Lord Proprietors. So there was a lot of conflict between the groups in North Carolina. There are a lot of conflicts that the Albemarle people said that the Pamlico people were getting more, and vice versa. And finally they got sick of it, the settlers here. And North Carolina has always been known, its settlers have always kind of been known as a independent, self-motivated, kind of don't tell me what to do type of group. And finally, Culpeper was a man who instigated a rebellion saying, we're done with the Lord Proprietors, we're done paying this tax, we're done with how they run this. And so the Lord Proprietor, they did a rebellion. The rebellion was eventually squashed, but the Lord Proprietors are like, You know, King, we got some crazy people living in North Carolina, and it is not as easy as we thought to govern or take care of the state. Not only were the people kind of had animosity between each other, these different groups, then they weren't thrilled with the Lord proprietors. Then the next group that really was the ones who were most taken advantage of were the Native Americans. And the Native American group, the Tuscarora, they said, okay, we're done. You can't just come in here, think you're taking our land, settle, claim it, and kick us off of the lifestyle and how we have lived for generations. So the Tuscarora rebelled against settlers. They were beginning to attack settlers. They would kill them and burn their settlement and burn their homes and things like that. So the Lord proprietors sent in some troops, and Tuscarora was eventually defeated. And with the defeat of Tuscarora, settlers began not just to move south. So here you have Virginia, and down here you have Albemarle Sound, and here you have Pamlico Sound. But now, instead of people just moving south and kind of living along these sounds, now with the Tuscarora defeat, people began to move west into the coastal plain in the Piedmont. So you have people moving and beginning to claim more land. So, most people live east of the fall line. Remember, the fall line is in the Piedmont. It's where the water does a quick drop from the mountains and the foothills down to the coastal plain. So now people began to move west. They really began to settle in the Piedmont. And these were a lot of immigrants. There were a lot of Germans from Germany who were coming, Scotch-Irish, the Scots from northern England, and the Irish next to England. A lot of faith-based groups, the Quakers, who again wanted to celebrate their religion as freely, and the Moravians. So there was a lot of reasons for Carolina growing. One thing, people just wanted land, so they left the Virginia. The whole idea of Tuscarora pushing the Native Americans out really invited, and the Lord proprietors advertising and trying to get people here. So that's how we have Carolina growing. The problem was they advertised people coming, but farming was very difficult for them. They were mostly poor compared to the colonists in the eastern part of the state. So these people who were living in the Piedmont, and remember we talked earlier about the land is not as good as it is in the coastal plain for farming. They began to have small farms, and they were poorer. It was a much greater struggle for them to make a living. So not only do you have this division between the Albemarle people and the Pamlico people, now you're getting a division in the state between the poor people, or the poor farmers in the west, and the farmers that are in the east along in the coastal plain with the better farmland, who are wealthier and have better access to shipping their goods out and trading. So this is how Carolina is growing. What I'd like you to do is just take a few minutes, look at your notes, and review how it's got settled and what were some of the major factors. Bring that to class tomorrow.